The morning after the storm, 6 men walked through the settlement in silence. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. 4 cabins had their roofs torn off. 2 walls had collapsed inward like crushed paper. A woodpile that had taken 3 weeks to stack was scattered across half a mile of frozen ground. The wind had done what the wind always does out here. It had taken everything that wasn't ready. But 1 cabin stood untouched. Not just standing, untouched. Snow packed tight against its sides. No visible damage. Smoke still rising from the chimney in a thin, steady thread. Like the storm had never arrived. Like whatever had passed over that stretch of land in the night had simply decided to go around it. The men stared for a long time. One of them had called the builder a fool. Not once, several times, and loudly, in the way that men who are certain of themselves tend to be loud. The roof was wrong. Everyone could see that. It came down too steep, too far, reaching almost all the way to the ground on 2 sides, barely a wall visible beneath it. It looked like a mistake, like a man who had miscalculated and kept going anyway, too stubborn to admit the error. "That's not a cabin," one oral account from the region recalls a neighbor saying. "That's a tent made of wood." Now, they were standing in the wreckage of their own conventional wisdom. The secret wasn't in the stove. It wasn't in the timber or the mortar or the thickness of the walls. What had saved that cabin was hiding in plain sight, in the one decision that had made everyone laugh. And most people, even now, still haven't understood why it worked. If you build in cold country or plan to, stay with this. Because what this man understood about wind, weight, and thermal geometry was quietly brilliant. And it cost him nothing extra to build. Subscribe if you want more forgotten engineering from people who had no room for failure. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Whether it's Montana, Manitoba, or somewhere in Northern Europe, we'd love to know who's out there. The winter of 1883 came early to the northern prairie settlements along the Dakota-Manitoba border. By the second week of October, the ground was already locked. Frost had crept into the soil so deep that a pickaxe bounced off it like stone. The settlers who had arrived that spring, most of them from the eastern seaboard, a few from the British Isles, 1 family from northern Germany, had spent the summer building. Quickly, with the particular urgency of people who know they are racing a season they have never actually faced before. Most of them built the way they knew. Straight walls for square sides, a pitched roof to shed rain. Simple gabled structures, 12 to 16 feet wide, laid out with a center hearth or a small cast-iron stove pushed against the north wall. Familiar shapes. Shapes from memory, from Pennsylvania farmhouses and Massachusetts barns and the agricultural cottages of County Donegal. Shapes that made sense back home. But this was not home. And the wind here was something that had no equivalent in the places they had come from. It was into this settlement. 14 cabins in various stages of completion, strung along a creek bottom for wind protection, that a man arrived in late September with 2 mules, a broad-shouldered frame, and a way of looking at the land that the other settlers would later describe in oral accounts collected by a regional historian in the 1920s as, like he was reading something written there that the rest of us couldn't see. His name was Elias Vance. He had come from the upper Great Lakes region, where he had spent 11 winters trapping and working timber camps near the Keweenaw Peninsula. He knew cold the way a sailor knows current, not from books, but from consequence. Vance did not rush his build. While the other men raced their walls upward and worried about window frames and door hinges, he spent the first 4 days doing something that puzzled everyone who watched. He walked. He walked the perimeter of his chosen lot at different hours. He stood at the northeast corner for long stretches and let the wind move around him. He pressed a dampened cloth to a stick and watched which direction it pulled in the morning, at midday, and at dusk. He was mapping the wind, one neighbor's account recalled. "We thought he was stalling, that he was afraid to start. He was not stalling. He was solving a problem that the rest of the settlement had not yet understood they had. The wind on the open prairie does not behave like wind in a forested valley or along a sheltered coastline. It comes in sustained, directional flows, predominantly from the northwest in winter, with gusts that can exceed 50 miles per hour for hours at a stretch. It does not gust and relent. It presses, and what it presses against, it finds every weakness in. gaps in chinking, undersized eaves. Any vertical surface facing the prevailing flow becomes, in effect, a sail. The flat north wall of a conventional cabin receives the full force of that pressure. It leaks air, loses heat, and in a serious storm, can fail structurally. Elias Vance had watched 2 cabins fail in exactly that way, years earlier, in the timber country north of Lake Superior. He was not going to build a sail. By the end of his first week on the lot, he had driven his corner stakes. The other settlers gathered, as they often did when a new man started to build. They watched him lay out the foundation line, and something immediately seemed wrong. The cabin footprint was normal enough, about 14 feet by 18 feet. But the roof stakes he drove next told a different story. They were set far lower on the north and west sides than anyone expected, far lower than made any structural sense to eyes trained on conventional framing. One man asked him directly what he was doing. Vance looked at the stakes, then at the man, then back at the northwest horizon. Making it smaller than the wind, he said. Nobody understood what that meant. Not yet. By mid-October, Elias Vance's cabin had taken a shape that no one in the settlement could quite categorize. The south and east walls stood at a normal height, roughly 7 feet from sill to eave, standard for a single-story frontier cabin. A man of average height could stand inside without issue, and the 2 small windows on the south face let in the low autumn light at a useful angle. So far, so familiar. But the north wall was barely 4 feet tall, and on the northwest corner, the roofline came down so steeply, so continuously, that the eave on that side terminated less than 18 inches from the ground. 18 inches. The roof didn't just overhang, it descended. It swept from the peak down at a severe angle, like a great wedge driven into the earth, covering the north and west exposures almost entirely. From a distance, standing to the northwest, you could barely see a cabin at all. What you saw was a roof, a long, sloping plane of split timber and sod, starting high on the south face and diving nearly to the frozen ground on the north. It looked, as more than one account describes it, like an animal that had tucked its head. The reaction from the other settlers was immediate, and it was not kind. "He's built a barn without the barn," one man said, and the phrase caught on, repeated with laughter around evening fires for the rest of October. Others were more direct in their skepticism. A man named Gruber, who had framed houses in Ohio for a decade and considered himself the settlement's authority on practical construction, walked around Vance's structure twice with visible impatience before delivering his verdict. The north wall was too short to be useful, the roofline was irrational, and the whole thing wasted good timber on angles that served no purpose. "You've got 4 feet of headroom on the north side," Gruber told him. "You can't even stand up in half your own cabin." Vance nodded. "Don't need to stand up on the north side," he said. "I need to sleep warm." The exchange drew more laughter. But Vance kept working. What he was building, though none of his neighbors had the framework to recognize it, was a structure designed around a single physical principle: minimize the surface area exposed to the prevailing wind, and use the roof itself as a thermal and aerodynamic shield. A conventional cabin presents 4 walls of roughly equal height to the elements. On a calm day, that's fine. But in a sustained northwest wind, the kind that dominates the Dakota winter from November through March, the north wall and west wall become the primary heat loss surfaces. Wind drives cold air against those faces. It finds every gap in the chinking and every imperfectly fitted log. It accelerates heat loss through convection, pulling warm air out through microscopic openings and forcing cold air in through others. On a night when the temperature drops to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the difference between a well-sealed north wall and a poorly sealed one can mean burning an extra cord of wood per month, or the difference between a livable interior temperature and a dangerous one. Vance's answer was to eliminate the north wall as a wind surface entirely. By bringing the roofline down to near ground level on the north and northwest faces, he converted what would have been a vulnerable vertical wall into a sloped aerodynamic plane. Wind striking a steeply pitched roof does not press against it the way it presses against a flat wall. It deflects. Physics sends it up and over rather than through. The cabin, from the northwest, was presenting a wedge to the weather. Not a sail, not a flat face. A wedge. The sod he packed along the base of that descending roofline added another layer. 18 inches of compacted earth and frozen grass has a thermal resistance that no single-layer log wall can match. That sod berm, which most of the settlers assumed was just leftover fill, sloppily piled, was intentional. It sealed the base of the roof against ground-level drafts and added an insulating mass that would hold what little warmth seeped down from the main living area. None of this was visible from the outside. From the outside, it just looked wrong. Gruber's phrase, "a barn without the barn," had spread through the settlement by the time the first real cold arrived in early November. Vance heard it. He didn't argue. He finished packing the sod berm, sealed his door frame with a double layer of buffalo hide, and split enough would last him through January. He was, by every visible measure, unconcerned. To understand what Elias Vance had actually built, you have to leave the settlement for a moment and think about what cold really is and how it moves. Most people, even today, think of heat as something a fire adds to a room. That's true as far as it goes. But the deeper problem in a frontier cabin isn't generating heat. A decent stove can do that readily enough with dry hardwood. The real problem is keeping it. And keeping it means understanding the three ways heat escapes from an enclosed space: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the simplest. Heat moves through solid material, through your log walls, your floor, your roof, from the warm side to the cold side. The thicker and denser the material, the slower that transfer happens. A 12-inch log wall conducts heat about 3 times more slowly than a standard modern 2x4 stud wall with minimal insulation. The old-growth timber Vance had access to was dense and tightly grained, a reasonable conductor barrier on its own. But conduction wasn't his main problem. Convection was. Convection is heat loss through moving air. When cold wind presses against the exterior of a wall, it accelerates the transfer of heat from the inside surface outward. It also finds and exploits every gap, every poorly sealed joint, every knothole, every imperfect chink of dried mud between logs. In a 35-mile-per-hour wind at minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the effective rate of heat loss through a conventional cabin wall can be 2 to 3 times higher than the same wall would experience on a calm night at the same temperature. The wind doesn't just feel colder. In thermal terms, it is colder. This is the same physics behind wind chill, not a perception, but a measurable increase in energy transfer from warm surfaces to cold moving air. Vance's descending roofline addressed this directly. A steeply sloped surface, when struck by a horizontal wind, deflects the airflow rather than stopping it. The wind rides up the slope and passes over. The cabin beneath that slope sits in a zone of reduced pressure and reduced wind velocity, effectively in the aerodynamic shadow of its own roof. Oral accounts suggest Vance had observed this effect on natural landforms. How a ridge of earth or rock could leave a sheltered zone on its lee side, where snow accumulated gently instead of being scoured away, where smaller animals built their dens. He had simply applied the same geometry to a building. But the roof also addressed radiation, the third mode of heat loss. Radiant heat loss occurs when warm interior surfaces emit infrared energy that passes through the wall or roof material and is lost to the cold sky above. A flat ceiling directly under a thin roof loses heat upward continuously on a clear winter night, when the sky can act as an effective radiating surface at temperatures well below the ambient air. A steeply pitched roof, packed with sod and a thick layer of compacted snow that accumulates naturally in the angle between the roof and the earth, creates a dead air insulating layer. Dead air, air that is not moving, is one of the most effective insulators known to vernacular builders. It is what makes fur warm, what makes a goose-down quilt effective, what makes the gap between a storm window and a primary window cut heat loss dramatically. The snow that piled against Vance's north roofline was not a problem to be cleared away. It was a resource. By late November, with 14 to 18 inches of packed snow against the lower third of that descending northern face, the cabin's most exposed aspect had effectively gained an insulating layer with an R value. the measure of thermal resistance, comparable to several inches of modern fiberglass batting. It cost him nothing. It renewed itself with every storm. Inside, the consequences were measurable in simple, practical terms. Neighboring settlers, those who had built conventional four-walled structures of similar log dimensions, reported burning between 4 and 6 cords of wood over the course of that first full winter. Vance, by his own account recorded in a letter preserved in a regional archive, burned just under 3 cords. On nights when his neighbors fed their stoves continuously to maintain interior temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Vance reported holding between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 63 degrees Fahrenheit through the night on a single loading of the firebox. The difference was not magic. It was geometry, aerodynamics, and the patient accumulation of dead air mass against the most vulnerable face of a small building in a very cold place. But the real test had not yet come. That would arrive in January, with no warning and no mercy. November passed without drama. The settlement settled into its cold routines. Wood was split and stacked. Animals were moved into lean-tos against the cabin walls. The creek froze in stages, first at the edges, then across the narrows, then solidly enough to walk on by the 3rd week of the month. Smoke rose from 14 chimneys each morning, and the days shortened until the sun barely cleared the southern horizon before beginning its retreat again. The cold itself was not yet extraordinary. Temperatures dropped to -10 degrees Fahrenheit on the worst nights in late November. Uncomfortable, certainly dangerous for anyone caught in the open without shelter, but manageable for a settlement that had spent the summer and fall preparing. Most families reported their interiors holding at 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit overnight with a moderate fire, which was cold enough to see your breath, but warm enough to sleep under wool blankets without risk. Elias Vance's cabin held steadily between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 64 degrees Fahrenheit on the same nights. His neighbors noticed. A few visited, ostensibly to borrow tools or exchange preserved food, but mostly to look. They walked through the low doorway on the south face, stood in the interior, and felt the warmth with undisguised surprise. It was not dramatically different from their own cabins, but it was consistently different, a difference of 8 degrees Fahrenheit to 12 degrees Fahrenheit that you felt immediately when you stepped inside, the way you feel the difference between a wool coat and a canvas one in the same wind. No one said he'd been right. Not yet. They were not yet cold enough to admit it. December arrived, and with it came the wind. Not the final storm, that was still weeks away, but the sustained northwest wind that is the constant companion of winter on the open prairie, the baseline condition that every structure in that settlement was now being tested against, hour after hour, day after day. It came at 20 to 30 miles per hour through most of December, gusting higher in the afternoons, dropping to a mere 15 miles per hour on what passed for calm days. It was the kind of wind that doesn't make headlines. It just drains heat, continuously, patiently, like a slow leak. Gruber's cabin, the one built by the settlement's most experienced framer, the Ohio man who had dismissed Vance's roofline with professional certainty, began to show the strain first. The chinking on his north wall cracked in the freeze-thaw cycle of early December, opening gaps that the wind found and exploited with pitiless efficiency. He resealed it twice, using a mixture of clay, ash, and dry grass. Each time, it held for a few days, then cracked again. The temperature inside his cabin dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit on 2 consecutive nights in the 2nd week of December, cold enough that the water bucket near the north wall developed a skin of ice by morning. He burned more wood. Everyone burned more wood in December than they had planned. Vance did not re-chink his walls that month. He had no north wall exposed to the weather to re-chink. The descending roofline meant that the log courses on his north face were protected from the direct wind pressure that caused the freeze-thaw cracking in the first place. His chinking held because it was never subjected to the full force of what it was supposed to resist. By Christmas, the mood in the settlement had shifted. The laughter about the barn without the barn had gone quiet. Nobody was making jokes about Vance's roofline anymore, but nobody was asking him about it directly, either. There is a particular silence between people when a thing they mocked has begun to prove itself, and they are not yet ready to acknowledge it out loud. Vance, for his part, was not the type to point it out. Oral accounts consistently describe him as a man of few unnecessary words. He helped his neighbors re-chink their walls when asked. He shared a technique for packing sod against the base of a north-facing wall to reduce ground-level draft, a smaller version of what his roofline had done at scale. Some of them used it, some didn't. The wood supply across the settlement was running lower than expected. 3 families had already sent riders to the nearest timber supply point, 12 miles east, to arrange additional deliveries before the deep cold arrived. The original calculations, 4 to 5 cords per family for the winter, were proving optimistic against a wind that never stopped. Vance's woodpile remained largely intact. January came. The temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the 3rd night of the new year and stayed below minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days. The wind held from the northwest at a steady 25 miles per hour. Interior temperatures in the conventional cabins fell to 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 42 degrees Fahrenheit on the worst nights, despite fires burning around the clock. 2 families moved in temporarily with neighbors to share body heat and reduce the number of stoves that had to be fed. And then, in the 3rd week of January, the sky to the northwest turned the color of a bruise. The real storm was coming. The sky gave them 6 hours of warning. That was all. By mid-afternoon on January 21st, the cloud bank to the northwest had built into something that did not look like ordinary weather. It was too uniform, too dark, too low at the horizon, a wall rather than a sky, advancing at a pace you could watch if you stood still long enough. Experienced men in the settlement had seen bad storms before. 2 of them had crossed the plains in the 1870s and described that advancing wall in terms that oral accounts later recorded with unusual consistency. It did not look like clouds. It looked like the sky was being replaced. By 4 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 14 degrees in under 2 hours. That single fact, 14 degrees in 2 hours, told anyone who understood the prairie everything they needed to know. This was not a snowstorm. This was a pressure collapse. A mass of Arctic air descending from the northwest with enough force and speed to push the existing cold air out of the way a hand sweeps objects off a table. The settlers moved fast. Animals were secured. Door gaps were stuffed with rags and spare leather. Children were pulled inside. Wood piles were raided for the largest, densest pieces, the ones that would burn longest and produce the most sustained heat through the hours ahead. Stoves were loaded to capacity and left to run hot. By 6 o'clock, the storm arrived. The wind came first, always the wind first. It did not build gradually. One account describes a near-complete calm at 5 minutes to 6, and then, without transition, a sustained roar at what survivors estimated as 55 to 65 miles per hour. The temperature outside, already at minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit before the storm front passed, dropped to an estimated minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit within the first hour of the storm's arrival. With the wind factored in, the effective thermal exposure on any unprotected surface, any north-facing wall, any exposed eave, any gap in a door frame, was the equivalent of temperatures well below minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the conventional cabins, the effect was immediate and severe. The fire in Gruber's stove had been burning hard for 2 hours before the storm arrived. He had loaded it with seasoned oak, the best wood he had, and had the interior up to a reasonable 58 degrees Fahrenheit when the wind hit. Within 40 minutes of the storm's arrival, the temperature in his cabin had dropped to 44 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the stove running at full draw. The north wall, already compromised by the December cracking, was now under direct assault. He could feel the cold moving through the log courses. Not a draft through a single gap, but a distributed chill across the entire north face, as if the wall itself had become a radiator running in reverse. He added wood. The stove burned hotter. The temperature stabilized at 41 degrees Fahrenheit. He burned through his entire indoor reserve, the wood he had stacked inside for exactly this kind of emergency, before midnight. Going outside to retrieve more from the woodpile was not a simple task in 60-mile-per-hour winds at minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a calculated risk every time the door opened. Across the settlement, similar accounts unfolded. In the two southernmost cabins, which had been built with their long axis running east-west, presenting full north wall exposure to the prevailing wind, the situation was worse. Interior temperatures fell to 36 degrees Fahrenheit in one and to an estimated 33 degrees Fahrenheit in the other. A family with 3 young children in the latter cabin made the decision to break through the shared wall into an adjacent storage lean-to, where they had piled feed sacks and extra hides and spent the night in that compressed, insulated space rather than in their own frozen interior. The storm ran for 9 hours. In Elias Vance's cabin, the evening was not entirely comfortable. No frontier structure in those conditions would have been, but it was manageable in a way that the rest of the settlement's night was not. His north face was not a wall. It was a roof, a steeply pitched slope of dense timber and compacted sod, angled at approximately 55 degrees from horizontal, meeting the ground on the northwest corner at a height of under 2 feet. The 60-mile-per-hour wind struck that slope and did what wind does with a well-angled surface. It deflected upward and over. The aerodynamic pressure on the structure as a whole was a fraction of what the flat-walled cabins experienced. There was no north wall to drive cold through. There was no exposed vertical face on the windward side, only that long, swept plain of timber and frozen sod. The snow, driven horizontally at that wind speed, packed into the angle between the roof base and the frozen ground and stayed there, building a berm of compressed white insulation that by midnight was nearly 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide along the entire northwest face. What had been 18 inches of packed sod against the lower roofline was now supplemented by 2 feet of dense, wind-driven snow, a combined insulating mass that effectively cut ground-level cold infiltration to near zero. Vance loaded his stove twice that night. His interior temperature, measured by a mercury thermometer he had brought from the Great Lakes country, dropped from a pre-storm 61 degrees Fahrenheit to a low of 52 degrees Fahrenheit around 2 in the morning, the coldest point of the storm's passage. By 4, with a single additional load of wood, it had returned to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. He slept for part of the night. That was the difference. Not poetry, not sentiment. 9 degrees of sustained thermal advantage, 52 degrees Fahrenheit at the cold floor versus 33 degrees Fahrenheit in the worst affected cabin, was the difference between a difficult night and a dangerous one, between sleep and survival mode wakefulness, between burning 2 loads of wood and burning everything you had and still losing the fight. Outside, the wind held until nearly 4 in the morning. When it finally broke, the silence it left behind was absolute. Dawn came pale and still. The wind had dropped entirely before first light. That sudden, complete cessation that sometimes follows a major prairie storm, as if the atmosphere itself had exhausted the effort and simply stopped. The sky that emerged was clear and brutally cold. Temperatures at sunrise sat at minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit, the air perfectly motionless, every surface coated in the fine crystalline frost that forms only in the deepest cold when moisture freezes directly out of the air itself. The settlement looked like a map of a battle. Gruber's roof had partially failed on the northwest corner. The rafter junction at the peak had shifted under the wind load, and 18 inches of ridgeline had pulled away from the top plate, opening a gap through which the storm had driven a drift of snow that now sat inside his cabin like a white monument to the night's events. He was not injured. He was furious and cold and very quiet. 2 cabins to the south, a section of the east wall on one structure had bowed outward under wind pressure and then cracked along a poorly chinked horizontal seam. Not a collapse, but a failure that let in a continuous flow of outside air, rendering that cabin uninhabitable until repairs could be made. The family had spent the latter part of the night in their neighbor's structure, 6 people in a space built for 3. The woodpile that a settler named Harwick had stacked against his west wall. 3 cords of split oak, carefully covered with a tarpaulin, had been scattered. The wind had gotten under the tarp at some point in the night and done what wind does to a neat pile of wood that is not sheltered. Turned it into a field of frozen debris distributed across 50 yards of snow-covered ground. He stood at the edge of it for a long moment that morning, calculating in the way people calculate when the number they arrive at is worse than they expected. 6 of the 14 cabins had suffered structural damage of varying severity. 3 had experienced interior temperatures that, by the settlers' own later accounts, would have been genuinely life-threatening for the very young or very old over a longer duration. The settlement had survived, collectively, but only just and not without cost in wood, in structural integrity, and in a particular kind of confidence that does not return easily once it has been shaken. The men gathered in the morning, as they had gathered the morning after every significant event in the settlement's young life. They walked the structures. They assessed. They spoke in the economical way of people who are cold and tired and working through what has to be done next. At some point in that morning walk, they arrived at Vance's cabin. It required a moment to take in. The north face was buried to the roofline in a smooth, unbroken berm of storm-driven snow, 2.5 feet deep along the base, tapering as the slope rose. The snow had packed so evenly against the descending roofline that the cabin appeared to have grown into the earth overnight, as if it had always been partly underground, as if the storm had simply revealed what the design always intended. The tarpaulin over Vance's splitwood stack, positioned on the south side in the lee of the cabin itself, was intact. Every piece of wood was where he had put it. The smoke from his chimney was already rising, thin and steady. He had been awake long enough to stoke the fire and start the morning. Gruber stood looking at the cabin for a long time. Whatever he was thinking, the accounts do not record in detail. What they do record is that he said nothing for several minutes. Then he said, to no one in particular, he put the roof where the wall should have been. It was the most technically precise thing anyone in the settlement had said about the structure since Vance began building it. And it was offered not with admiration. Exactly. The emotional register was more complex than that, but with the particular flatness of a man recognizing, in real time, the limits of what he had known. Vance came outside a few minutes later. He looked at the settlement the way he had looked at it that first week, steadily, without hurry. He offered to help with the structural repairs. No explanation, no commentary on the outcome of the night. Just the offer of an extra pair of hands. Several men took him up on it. Over the following 3 days, the settlement repaired what could be repaired quickly and assessed what would need to wait for spring. And in that period of cold, shared labor, something shifted. The questions started. Not loud questions, not the kind that require a man to openly admit he had been wrong, but quiet ones, asked while hands were busy with work and eyes could look somewhere other than at the person being asked. What angle did you say that north face runs at? How deep did you pack the sod on the base? What did you put under the roofing timber to keep the moisture from working through? Vance answered each question directly and without elaboration. He did not say, I told you. He did not say you should have listened. He answered what was asked. By the end of January, 2 of the settlers had sketched plans for modifications to their own structures before the following winter. One of them planned to add a dramatically extended roof overhang on his north face, piling sod against the new lower eave line. It was not the same design as Vance's. The existing wall was already there and could not be unmade, but it was the same instinct applied to what was possible. The mockery had not just ended. It had inverted. What Elias Vance built on the Dakota Prairie in the autumn of 1883 was not, as it turned out, an original invention. That is one of the most important things to understand about it. The man was not a genius operating in isolation. He was a transmitter, someone who had absorbed a building logic that existed in fragments across multiple cold climate traditions and had applied it with unusual clarity to a specific situation. The genius, if we want to use that word, was not in the idea itself, but in the decision to trust it when everyone around him was working from a different set of assumptions. The principle his cabin embodied, reducing wind-exposed vertical surface area by extending the roofline dramatically downward on the prevailing wind side, appears in vernacular building traditions across several cold climate cultures, each arriving at a similar solution through the same pressure. Survival in an environment that punishes conventional geometry. In Iceland, the traditional turf house, known as the torfbear, was built with roof surfaces that in some cases extended nearly to grade level on exposed sides, with thick walls of stacked turf providing both structural support and insulation. These structures, documented by architectural historians and still partially standing in preserved form, maintained interior temperatures that astonished early European travelers. Comfortable living spaces in an environment that routinely delivered sustained winds and temperatures that would challenge any modern insulated structure. The thermal key was not the stove. It was the mass and geometry of the structure itself. In the Scottish Highlands and the Northern Isles, the Black House, the traditional longhouse of the Hebridean Islands, was built with double-thick dry stone walls and a thatched roof that extended well beyond the wall face, creating an insulating dead air gap between the thatch and the inner wall surface. The roof was deliberately set low on the windward side. Local oral tradition, as collected by ethnographic researchers in the early 20th century, consistently held that the roof was considered the primary defense against weather, not the walls. The walls were secondary. The roof was the first line. In the subarctic regions of northern Scandinavia and Finland, the port and various forms of earth shelter construction shared a similar principle: get the vulnerable surfaces out of the wind by making them into slopes. A sloped surface in a 50-mile-per-hour wind experiences fundamentally different aerodynamic loading than a vertical wall of equal area. The force exerted by wind on a surface is a function not just of wind speed, but of the angle of incidence, how directly the wind strikes the surface. A surface angled at 55 degrees from horizontal, like Vance's north roofline, receives a fraction of the direct pressure that the same surface would receive if oriented vertically. The structural loads are different. The convective heat loss is different. The infiltration risk is different. Everything about the physics improves when you tilt the target. To put it in terms that translate to modern construction standards, the R value of a wall, its resistance to heat transfer, is only one part of the thermal performance equation. A wall with an R20 rating exposed to a 40-mile-per-hour wind loses effective thermal performance because of the convective stripping on its outer surface. The wind removes the warm boundary layer of air that naturally forms against any warm surface and replaces it continuously with cold air, accelerating heat loss beyond what the R value calculation alone would predict. Reducing wind exposure by geometry, by orientation, by sheltering is thermally equivalent in real-world conditions to significantly increasing wall insulation. Vance had no insulation in the modern sense. He had geometry. The numbers that emerge from a careful reconstruction of that winter's conditions are instructive. A conventional 14 by 18-foot cabin with 4 vertical walls of standard frontier log construction, oriented with a flat north face to the prevailing wind, loses heat at a rate that, under the conditions of that January storm, would require approximately 18,000 to 22,000 BTUs per hour to maintain an interior temperature above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That translates, in practical terms, to a stove running near capacity for most of the night, consuming a cordwood roughly every 12 to 15 days under sustained winter conditions. Vance's structure, with its north and northwest vertical wall exposure reduced by approximately 65 to 70% through the descending roofline, and with the additional insulating mass of sod and accumulated snow against the lower face, would have required an estimated 11,000 to 13,000 BTUs per hour under the same conditions to hold the same interior temperature. The stove ran at moderate output. The wood lasted. The geometry did the rest of the work for free. This is the verdict that physics delivers, independent of opinion, independent of reputation, independent of who laughed at whom in the autumn of 1883. The structure performed because it was correctly designed for its environment. Not impressively designed, not dramatically over-engineered. Correctly designed, which is to say, designed with accurate attention to what the actual forces were and how the materials at hand could best respond to them. That is what engineering is, stripped of credentials and institutional authority. It is the accurate modeling of physical reality, followed by the disciplined choice to act on that model even when the model produces an answer that looks strange. Vance's cabin looked strange. The physics did not care. The settlement on the Dakota-Manitoba border is long gone. Most frontier settlements of that era dissolved within a generation. absorb into larger towns as roads improved and the economics of isolated homesteading shifted, or simply abandoned when the land proved less yielding than the promises that had brought people to it. The specific location of the 14-cabin community described in these accounts has not been definitively identified in published historical records, and the oral histories from which this reconstruction draws are fragmentary by nature, passed through 2 or 3 generations before being collected, subject to the compressions and embellishments that all oral transmission involves. But the building logic Elias Vance applied did not disappear with the settlement. It survived, as good ideas tend to survive, by proving itself repeatedly in enough different contexts that it became impossible to ignore entirely, even if it never achieved the mainstream adoption that its performance warranted. The principle of the earth-sheltered, wind-deflecting structure, with rooflines that engage the ground rather than terminate above it, runs through a remarkable range of cold-climate vernacular traditions that persisted well into the 20th century and, in some cases, are experiencing a quiet revival today. In Iceland, the restored Torfbear farmsteads at Glombear and Arborer give a clear material record of what multi-century cold-climate building intelligence produced. Thick-walled, turf-roof structures whose interior temperatures were documented by early 20th century researchers as remaining above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the deepest winter, without supplemental heating. Warmed primarily by the body heat of occupants and livestock, by the enormous thermal mass of the turf walls and roof, and by the geometry that presented no flat vertical face to the prevailing Atlantic wind. These are not primitive buildings. They are sophisticated thermal systems built from the only materials that were available, optimized over centuries of feedback from a climate that punished every wrong decision immediately. In the Faroe Islands, traditional construction placed the most sheltered face of a structure toward the prevailing southwest wind. Not because the builders had access to aerodynamic theory, but because enough structures had failed over enough generations that the survivors had learned, empirically, what worked. The knowledge was encoded in practice long before it was encoded in language. In North America, analogs appear in the sod house construction of the Great Plains, where the dugout, partially or fully recessed into a south-facing hillside, used the earth itself as the windward wall, presenting only a low south face to the sky. The dugout was routinely dismissed by settlers who arrived with Eastern assumptions about what a proper house looked like. Too dark, too earthen, too primitive, until the first serious winter demonstrated that the family in the dugout was warmer, burning less fuel, and sleeping more soundly than the family in the upright, four-walled frame house 40 yards away. The parallel to Vance's situation is not coincidental. It is the same error repeated across geography and generation. The assumption that a building should look a certain way, and that looking correct is the same thing as performing correctly. It is an error that the modern construction industry, with its standardized framing dimensions and its energy codes and its R-value tables, has not entirely escaped. A house built to code in northern Minnesota is a house that meets minimum legal requirements for thermal performance under standardized test conditions. It is not necessarily a house that has been designed with specific, intelligent attention to the direction of the prevailing winter wind, the local patterns of snow accumulation, the orientation of the lot relative to the sun's winter path, and the aerodynamic implications of the roofline geometry. Vance had no code. He had consequence. The difference in motivation produces a difference in result that is, in some ways, still visible today. In the heating bills, in the woodpile consumption, in the comfort of the people inside when the wind comes from the northwest at 2 in the morning and the temperature is falling. The earth-sheltered building movement that gained momentum in North America in the 1970s and 1980s, driven partly by the energy crisis and partly by the work of researchers and architects who had studied exactly these vernacular traditions, demonstrated in controlled, documented conditions what frontier builders had known empirically for generations, that a structure partially recessed into the earth, with its most exposed face angled rather than vertical, and with its windward surfaces, protected by berms of soil or accumulated snow, consistently outperforms a conventional above-ground structure of equivalent floor area by margins that range from 30 to 60% in heating energy consumption, depending on climate and orientation. 30 to 60%. That is not a marginal efficiency gain. That is the difference between a cord of wood and 3 cords. Between a heating bill that is manageable and one that is not. Between a cabin that holds 52 degrees Fahrenheit in a January storm and one that holds 33 degrees Fahrenheit. The men in that settlement learned this the hard way on a January night in 1883 from a man who had learned it in the timber camps north of Lake Superior, from men who had learned it before him, from people who had been living in this landscape for far longer than any European settler, and who had understood for generations that in a cold country, the most important thing a building can do is stop trying to fight the weather and start trying to work with the shape of it. There's a particular kind of knowledge that does not fit in a book. It fits in a hand that has chinked 100 log walls and learned which ones cracked first. It fits in a pair of eyes that has watched the snow settle differently on 2 adjacent roof lines and understood, without being told, what that difference means for the people sleeping under them. It fits in the decision, made in September when the weather is still mild and the pressure to just get it done is enormous, to spend 4 days walking a piece of land before driving the first stake. Elias Vance was not a formally trained engineer. By the standards of his era, he was not an expert in anything that would have been recognized by that name. He was a man who had spent enough winters in enough cold places to have developed an accurate model of how heat moves and how wind behaves, and how the geometry of a structure determines which one wins. He applied that model under social pressure in a community that was watching and laughing, and he held to it through the months when the weather was not yet cold enough to prove him right. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost when we focus on the engineering. The engineering is real. The physics is real. The 9-degree difference between his interior and his neighbors at 2 in the morning during a 60-mile-per-hour storm is real, or as real as careful historical reconstruction allows us to say. But the decision to build differently, to accept the mockery, to trust the model, to resist the social gravity that pulls every community toward conventional solutions because conventional solutions look right even when they perform poorly, that decision is the one that actually made the difference. The engineering was only useful because someone was willing to be wrong in public for several months before the winter proved him right. This matters beyond the specific question of how to build a cabin roof. We are at this particular moment in history, surrounded by buildings that look correct and perform poorly. Houses framed with dimensional lumber and fiberglass insulation, oriented by lot line rather than by sun path or wind direction, with roof lines designed by aesthetic convention rather than by climate logic. Heating systems that consume enormous quantities of energy to compensate for structural geometries that were never seriously analyzed in terms of their actual thermal exposure. Neighborhoods in Minnesota and Manitoba and Montana that are built in their fundamental orientation and massing, as if the prevailing winter wind were not a variable worth considering. None of this is inevitable. It is a choice, a collective, institutionalized choice, built into zoning codes and architectural conventions and the economics of standardized construction. And it is a choice that has a cost, paid in energy and in fuel, and in the particular discomfort of a building that cannot quite hold warmth against the weather it was built to face. The men who rebuilt after that January storm in 1883 knew something at the end of that winter that they had not known at the beginning. Some of them acted on it before the next season. Some of them did not. The costs and complications of modifying an existing structure are real, and not every lesson, even a painful one, translates immediately into change practice. But the knowledge was in them. The direct, embodied knowledge of the difference between a wall that held and a wall that did not, between a fire that kept pace with the cold and one that fell behind despite everything. That knowledge is available to us now, too, in the vernacular traditions that have been studied and documented, in the material evidence of the turf houses and black houses and earth-sheltered structures that survive precisely because they worked in the physics that has not changed since the wind first came down from the northwest over the Dakota Prairie on a January night in 1883. The question is the same one Vance faced in September of that year, with his corner stakes in his hand and his neighbors watching. Are you willing to build for what the environment actually is, or for what a building is supposed to look like? He drove the stakes where the physics told him to drive them. The roof came down to the ground, and in the morning after the storm, the smoke rose thin and steady from the only chimney in the settlement that had not spent the night losing the fight. This content is historical and educational in nature. It represents a very similar reconstruction of frontier building practices and does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice. Always consult qualified professionals and observe applicable building codes before undertaking any construction project.